Welcome back to another video. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about the differences between half steps and whole steps. So let's take a careful look at the keyboard again, making sure to review the things that we've already learned. So you remember that this natural or white key to the immediate left of the group of two black keys is called C. This specific C is middle C, which in terms of its octave designation is C4. So I want you to observe a couple of things. Remember that we have four interval size categories. From smallest to largest, we have unisons, steps, skips, and leaps. In this particular video, I'd like to explore steps in a bit more nuance and a bit more detail than we did earlier. So let's start with C, and we're going to go up a step and down a step and see if we can observe any differences. So from C up to D, right, C4 up to D4, there is, as you can see, a black key in between. And yet, from C to D is still a size of two letters, C, D. And if we go down from C, C down to B, that's also a step, also a size of 2, because we're dealing with two letters, C and B, 1 and 2. So does this black key, or the accidental between C and D, affect the way that we measure the size of these two steps? Well, the answer is no, because when it comes to size, which is just a measurement of the number of letters from where you start to where you end as you proceed alphabetically. So put much more simply, remember that interval size is just counting the number of letters in an interval. Now, the letters are only in relation to these naturals, or these white keys. So what do we do about these black keys? Well, they get somewhat different labels. So before we get into that, let's just make sure that you understand that these two steps are not quite the same. Not quite the same. And that's because we have to get a little more nuanced and differentiate between half steps and whole steps. So let's begin with a half step, or a semitone. And so this, from C to this black key, that's a half step. From this black key to this white key is a half step. From this white key to that white key is also a half step. So what can you deduce from these examples as to how to define a half step? A half step is the closest that any two adjacent keys can be to one another. So for example, from C to D, well, this is not a half step because there's something in between. There's something closer to each one of these keys. The black key is closer to this white key. This black key is also closer to this white key. So in fact, if this is a half step and this is a half step, then these two put together, two half steps, equal one whole step. It's just like in math, right? Two halves equal a whole. So let's point out all of the half steps just to be totally clear. Half step, half step, half step, half step, half step, because even though there's no black key in between these two white keys, it doesn't matter because they're as close to one another as possible. Half step, half step, half step, half step, half step, half step, half step. You get the point. So there are tons of half steps all over the keyboard, and then anytime you put two of them together, you've got one whole step. So for example, whole step, whole step. Remember, this is a half step, this is another half step. So from here to there, from this white key to this black key is a whole step. From this black key up to this black key is another whole step, right? One half step, second half step, whole step for the same reasons as we just covered. And from this black key to this white key, half step, this is a whole step. So hopefully you feel pretty good about these differences. So that means that when we go back to our initial example, these two steps from C up to D and from C down to B, these are not quite the same in terms of their qualifications, right? This step is qualified as having two half steps inside of it. This step, right, in terms of just the interval size category, has a single half step. That means that we have to add a second dimension or a second component to how we describe intervals, not just in terms of interval size, which remember counts the number of letters, but also some qualifier that counts the number of half steps. And that qualifier is called interval quality. So interval quality measures the number of half steps in an interval, and interval size measures the number of letters in an interval. So just to be really quick, if I go from C up to D, I know that this has 2 half steps. If I go from C down to B, this has 1 half step. So which one of these is the larger interval according to the number of half steps? Well, obviously C up to D with 2 half steps. So in music, we can certainly say this is the larger step or the larger second, right, because size 2, and this is the smaller one, but musicians don't use that terminology, large and small. They substitute it for the words major for large and minor for small. So this is the major step or the major second, and this is the minor second, the small step.